without further ado, I will pass it on to you, Professor Cohen. Take it away.
Thank you, Sean. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much to the student group, Student Government Association, who has put these sessions on. I've been trying to attend all of them, and Mackenzie, Ishan, and others. I will say, if you haven't done them, they're online. And last week, this started out mostly looking at faculty take on COVID. And last week, it turned to implicit bias, racial bias, and Professor Maria Triana, a really, really well done presentation if you haven't seen it. And next week, Professor Bruce Berry is going to talk on ethics in the workplace and how that relates to racial issues. And both of those are focused on sort of the individual level. And they very much relate to my topic today, but I'm bringing it up to the corporate and policy level, not to the individual. Individuals obviously are involved in the everyday decision making, but I'm going to step back and look at the corporate policy level. So let me first of all give you just a little bit of background on me. I'm an economist. I'm not an ethicist. I'm not an organizational design person. PhD in economics. Prior to joining the faculty, I've served as an economist at various government agencies, Environmental Protection Agency, Federal Trade Commission. And I've been here since 1986, been at Owen for a long time. Courses that I teach include sustainability courses, corporate strategies for environment, social, and governance issues, various types of courses like that. I've got a course on law and business of climate change. And as Ishan mentioned, I've got a course that I'm just designing now, frankly, with the help of students, with some of our second-year MBA students, which I'm titling the Strategic Business Solutions to Address Structural Racism. This is a topic that I've worked on for many years in this particular context, and I want to talk about today, which is racial disparity in lending. So as I said, I've been writing on this topic for over 20 years, and actually the examples I'm going to give you are quite old, but I'm going to, towards the end, talk much more about today, because in fact, this is still going on today in various aspects, and so I want to talk about that. I will say that maybe by way of disclaimer, that I've been an expert witness in lots of class action lawsuits, both by private attorneys as well as government lawsuits. This is outside of my Vanderbilt activities, but I've been called upon to testify and do statistical analyses on a lot of these cases. So a lot of this, what you're going to see, is actually firsthand research that I've done. And this topic in particular, for the last 10, 12 years, I spent one class period just on this topic in my corporate strategies for ESG class, and I will be talking about this as well in my structural racism class. And if you're particularly interested, this is being recorded, so you could actually go and pull this up, but I do have a publication. It's relatively easy to read for the non-academics, but it is an academic publication looking at auto lending, racial disparity, and class action litigation. So a lot of this is taken from that paper. Okay. So let me step back and give you the context. So I'm going to take a very simple example. This is a typical auto loan transaction at a car dealership. You walk into a car dealer and you're shopping for a car, and this is very typical of shoppers. They say, I'm looking for a new car and I don't want to spend more than X dollars a month. That's sort of my budget. In this case, I'm going to use $375. You can see this is somewhat dated if you've looked for new car prices these days, but could be a used car as well. So then after you sort of negotiate and you agree on a price for the car, then you sort of get shuffled to what's called the F&I, the Finance and Insurance Office, an individual who is going to help you obtain financing. Now, you don't have to obtain financing through the auto dealer, and I'll come back to that. You can certainly obtain it elsewhere, but it's quite common for individuals to use the dealership. So what is the F&I person saying? Let me see what rate I can get for you. First of all, I want to make sure I can get you qualified for a loan, but we work with many different lenders and we'll find you the best deal. Okay, so that's sort of the story that you're often told. And what's going on behind the scenes is, well, first of all, they are trying to find you the credit and find you a contract that'll work. given the budget that you've asked for. But they're also shopping around. And so behind the scenes, you could see, for example, 3 lenders that you would qualify for. And of course, this is private information to the F&I person at the dealership. And they will say, well, look, I'm looking at it, and I'd say, I can go to lender A, and they'll let me mark the loan up 3%, lender B 5%, and lender C, there's no markup, but you can get a contract price. You basically get a commission, $250 in this example, for writing the contract. So these are just, this is just an agent for a lender, is what this dealer is doing. They're not directly lending you the money. So that's what's going on behind the scenes, and then you get the deal. The deal is, you've qualified for a loan. I got your payments within your limit, in this case, $375 a month. And of course, what this gentleman here is thinking is that, well, I can get 14%, your interest rate is 14%. It's really only 9%, but I can mark it up another 5 and charge you 14%. And I'll show you in a second, that means that there's additional profits to the dealer. And to be quite honest, sometimes this is the most profitable part of a auto transaction. You can oftentimes, these dealers can make more money on the lending than they can on the car itself. So what does this deal look like? Well, this is a example, basically what I'm showing you. So we take a $16,000 loan for 60 months. You can see the interest rate's 9%. This was written in the days when that was actually a typical interest rate. So you have $332 in monthly payments. So the individual, if not marked up, would be paying $332 a month. Total payments about $19,900 for a $16,000 car. And the dealer then gets the $16,000 for the car. Okay, so that's how it works. And then the rest goes to the loan company. Now, in this example where I said we're marking it up by 5%, you can see what happens. So what happens is, instead of paying $332 a month, the consumer is paying $372 a month, $40 more a month. And of course, that over time adds up to another $2,400 over the life of the loan. And what happens is the dealer now gets an additional $1,800 in profits. Okay. So that's sort of how the deal works. Now, let me think about being an economist. I'll think quickly about the supply and the demand. So let's look at how this market works on the supply side first. So as I showed you, the dealer can shop around for a lending source. And there's intense competition for dealer business. There are what these captive lenders. They typically make up 20 to 40% of a dealer's business. But there's also banks, credit unions, other lending institutions. And the dealer can have relationships with several of these at one time. So the dealer is really an agent for the lender, and he brings to the lender a ready, willing, and able customer to the table. The dealer doesn't really retain any risk, because all they're doing is passing along the note to the lender. And typically, I showed you $2,400 in additional payments, but only $1,800 in the markup goes to the dealer, because about 75% of the markup actually goes to the dealer. The rest gets retained by the lender, because after all, they're paying this dealer this markup, but not everyone continues their loan throughout the life of the loan. You can pay it off early, you could default, etc. So, but the dealer doesn't retain any of that risk. All that risk gets shifted to the lender, and then that's why they're retaining part of that markup. And I will say, I'm not probably going to spend much time on this, but there is sort of this quality of borrower information. The fact is that the dealer could know a lot about the borrower that the lender has no information about. They can get, simple example is somebody walks in and says, I'm about to lose my job. I need my car right now. Well, I still have good credit. And of course, the dealer would never tell the lender that. They would fill out all the credit applications and everything looks hunky-dory. But anyways, that we may come back to that later. So now what about the demand side of the market? Okay. The customer oftentimes has little or no knowledge of their credit rating. Now that's changing over time. I'll come back to that. But it's one thing to know your credit score, which in these days, in earlier days, nobody really did. Now you can get access to that. But it's another thing to really know, will you or will you not be able to obtain credit for this kind of a loan? But I think more importantly, there's lack of customer knowledge about markups in general. First of all, most customers come in thinking about how much I'm going to pay. They may think about an interest rate. They oftentimes value the convenience of borrowing at a dealer. That's certainly worth your time. So they may not shop around. They may not realize they can shop around or know what their credit availability is. So there is a lack, but I think more importantly, there's a lack of knowledge on the fact that there's a markup. We go into a retail store, we assume that there's some profit involved. And the same thing with an automaker, a dealer, you assume that the dealer's making money, and there may be some fee associated with the lending, but not too many people realize that they literally can mark the loan up, and that's a discretionary thing. Of course, the dealer has perfect information about your credit rating, and they can mark this up, and it's hidden, and it's subjective. They can mark it up 0, or they can mark it up, in this example, up to 5%. So given that, the dealer is likely to assess the customer's willingness to pay in setting the interest rate that they're going to charge. And they may look for signals of price sensitivity. So they don't know how much you're willing to pay, but they're trying to figure out in a negotiating setting how much you're willing to pay. And of course, they're not telling you that they're negotiating on this. They're essentially doing this behind the scenes in a way. So they possibly will look for ways to discriminate on price depending on the person who's walking in, thinking about, well, this person will be willing to pay 14% interest or 12% interest, or they come in knowing that they're going to pay a certain amount a month. So let's take a look at typical markups. And again, this is old, but this is old data, but this is still going on. So, and I don't know if the exact numbers are the same now, but 30 to 60% of customers walking into dealerships are getting marked up. And of those marked up, the average markup is anywhere from $800 to $1,200. So I showed you kind of an outlier extreme in my example. And that means that if you do the multiplication, the average markup over all customers is about $300 to $600. It's not a huge amount because it gets amortized over the life of the loan, but it is markup. And as I said, dealers generally keep about 75%. Markup rates certainly vary over time and by company, but the fact is they're consistent. So here's what I want to call what actually the industry called the home runs when dealerships were interviewed. Former F&I people would call these the home runs. And here's an example. This is coming out of some litigation. This was a case, this was an individual. The first one is a dealer a purchaser in Arizona, borrowed against a $20,000 purchase. So they essentially borrowed $20,394 for a new car. And the buy rate, which is the rate that GMAC had quoted, GMAC is General Motors Acceptance Corporation, it's the wholly owned captive subsidiary of General Motors at the time. And the dealer was quoted 10.49%. And in this particular case, they marked the loan up by 19.41%. In other words, they charged an APR of almost 30%. I think that probably I don't know this for a fact, but Arizona probably had a 30% legal limit on APR. But anyways, what that meant is the individual financed $20,000. The markup on the loan, not the loan itself, the markup alone was $15,732. So that means that the dealer made tens of thousands of dollars on this particular loan. And of course, the value of the car itself was only $20,000. But that's not just one example. Those are some of the largest ones. So when I looked at the distribution of markups, this is again one example. This is General Motors. What you see is that the top 1% of people, if you rank them by those who are paying the most markup versus the least markup, you take the top 1%, they accounted for 14% of the markup. Top 5% accounted for almost half, or 42%. And the top 10% accounted for 64% of the markup. So it's these home run hits, it's these large markups that are making most of the profits for these dealers. So this is really a kind of a consumer issue, but then it moved into the legal arena. Now, it's not illegal to charge different customers different prices, except in certain transactions. So there's nothing against the law in charging, you can haggle for all kinds of things. You know, in the United States, we're not used to negotiating over prices for in the supermarket. In some countries, they do that. But it's certainly not illegal to charge different customers different prices. But we have something called the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in the US, 1974 was passed. And this goes back to a whole nother conversation about historical racism and discrimination, where individuals were just not given access to financial markets, housing markets, labor markets. And so we have civil rights acts essentially protecting certain classes of individuals because of historical discrimination. So you can see, by the way, the ECOA, as it's called, it's illegal to discriminate in credit transactions on the basis of race, national origin, religion, sex, marital status, age, and source of income. And I do want to note just a minor thing, but quite interesting on sexual orientation. The law doesn't say sexual orientation. If you've been following recently, Supreme Court decision, not on Equal Credit Opportunity Act, it actually had to do with employment, where the Supreme Court said, yes, very similar law in the employment area, workplace, and essentially said it covers sexual orientation as well. So this had been, and a side note, but an important one, the regulatory agencies, Department of Justice, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, had sort of been floundering over whether or not they would incorporate sexual orientation in their interpretation of this law. And they had been saying yes, but with the Trump administration, there had been questions about whether they would agree to that or enforce that. But anyways, long and short is, even though it doesn't apply directly to the Supreme Court decision, implicitly, I think everyone would agree is likely to apply to this as well. So anyways, a little distraction. But coming now to the racial component of this study, this is really what the lawsuits were all about. They went to this Equal Credit Employment Credit Access law and said, let's take a look and see whether or not this policy of allowing markups has a disparate impact on African Americans. And so what we did was we essentially went to birth certificate data from California. We went to driver's license data, where, believe it or not, in 14 states, you actually have to identify your race. That harkens back to some interesting days, but it is, in fact, the law in 14 states. And through a series of legal discovery, we were able to obtain all of that data and match up customer records to determine what the race of the borrower was. So, in example, Nissan Motors Acceptance Corporation, we had about 300,000 transactions. These are borrower transactions, and about 19% of them were African Americans, about 10% Hispanics. Similar with General Motors Acceptance, Ford. Overall, during this time period, I looked at over 3 million transactions, and about 10% of them were African Americans. So what did we find? So here's an example. This is Nissan Motors. 72% of African Americans were marked up versus 47% of whites. If you looked at the average markup for African Americans was $972. It was $462 for whites. So they were essentially paying twice the markup. We didn't have much access to Hispanic because that's not self-identified, but there are ways you can do that based on name and census, and you can come up with a probabilistic estimate. And this is actually done in compliance, where you look at the surname of the individual, actually both names of the individual, and you statistically estimate the likelihood that the individual borrower was Hispanic. And we did that in some cases we're able to do that. And we did that, and you can see the same pattern actually in Florida. Hispanics always paying, no matter what the average markup was, they were always paying more than whites. This wasn't just a few places, and it wasn't just the South, by the way, if you're curious. These are the 14 race-coded states. You can see a lot of them are in the South: Alabama, Florida. But then you have Iowa, you have Nebraska, you have Wisconsin. And in every state where we had driver's license data, it looks like you can see we had about 60% of the transactions. In every case, the difference was basically African Americans were paying 2, 3, or 4 times what whites were paying in terms of markup. And going back to my home run hits, what we found was that African Americans were highly overrepresented in the home run category. So Nissan, this is an example. African Americans represented about 18.5% of their customers, but 52% of the customers were African American, for those who paid $2,000 or more in markup. 62% of those who paid $3,000 or more in markup. General Motors, very similar kind of thing.
So we have some questions that are coming in from the audience.
Sure.
First one here is from a community member that asks, when we talk about white privilege, we talk also about the privilege not to have the difficult conversations. Do you feel that it's starting to change?
I hope so.
Ooh.
And
I'm sorry, guys.
Because I think
Ooh.
that why
I thought that was coming into me. My iPhone, which I put on mute, was playing a TED Talk earlier, and all of a sudden it popped up, and I didn't realize. I thought you were asking me a question. Sorry. Little glitch there with technology, like always. Anyways, as you can see, GMAC had, again, about 8.5% customers African-American and 33% of those who paid $3,000 or more in markup. Similar kinds of things if you go state by state. So then the question really becomes, why do we observe these disparities? Okay, and that's really the important question. So from a legal side, and you can also think about this as an economic side, but we'll come back to sort of the business strategy issue. So from a legal side, if it takes more time, or if there's a risk of default, or if there's some kind of cost-based justification why in the data it looks like African Americans are paying more than whites, it may be legally justified. Now, whether it's morally justified, whether it makes good reputation sense for companies, that's another story. But from the law side, if you can justify it based on actual costs to the firm of providing a service, which makes some sense, okay? But then there's all kinds of other illegal reasons, which we could think about why a market like this might end up with these kinds of differences, other than pure, the last one is pure discrimination. It may be racial animus, but there also may be other reasons. It may be African Americans don't know much about the markups. They may not have as much information. They may not have the cultural proclivity to negotiate, which is quite fascinating, and there's actually some truth to that. Some of the sociologists, African American sociologists, have explained that to me, and they've written about this, the cultural differences in the negotiation proclivity. Dealers may simply use race as a proxy without any kind of racial animus. They might think about negotiating skills. Again, maybe they know about this, maybe they think, maybe for whatever reason, there may be, again, simple economics and negotiations and things like that. But all of these have, whether they're based on racial animus or not, they have a disparate impact on African Americans, and they're illegal under the law. So there's one side is sort of what's the impact, the other is whether it's legal or not. So coming back to this question about can we explain it by cost differences? Can we explain it in some way? And so we looked at, here's the best credit ratings. You can see African Americans, whether it's the best credit ratings, the worst credit ratings, they're still paying more. So purely credit risk didn't explain these differences. Here's another example. This is another company, this is GMAC. No matter what credit tier you went to, these are the best credit tiers. The difference between black and white was just always there. So then I conducted all kinds of other tests. I did multiple regression analysis. controlling for all of the things you could think of that would explain interest rates. And then we looked at what kinds of objective things, for example, does it take more time? So we controlled for, when we could, the amount of time to approve your loan, whether you had to go back and rehash the loan. And then some questions came in as, well, maybe we have to look at the whole package. Maybe African Americans are paying less on the car and more on the markup of the loan, and it balances out. And in fact, it wouldn't be a legal justification. It might be, you might want to say if it's the package deal that matters, do they pay more or less? The bottom line, by the way, is they actually paying more both on the price of the car as well as the financing of the car when we had that kind of information. But all of that, none of that could really explain away the findings. So these cases started to settle. The first one was actually Nissan Motors, without going into all the details. The settlement, the legal settlement, called for a markup cap. It was very particular. It was, there was a cap on how much people could charge to mark up on the loans, but also it's very specific, tailored to African-American buying habits. There was education campaigns, that sort of thing. Affirmative disclosure on future contracts, telling consumers that they can negotiate with the dealer. So these were the kinds of things. We'll say that there was no money given back to borrowers, which is kind of sad, but that was a legal issue as well. That did actually happen in the Toyota case, and I think it was because that was filed in New York. But the appeals courts in the different cases basically limited the ability for borrowers to receive money back, even though the lawyers tried to do that. So after the Nissan case settled, basically all of these lawsuits, one was actually tried. It was Primus Automotive Financial. That's the only one that did go to trial, and the judge ruled against the company. All the major lenders, Bank of America, Bank One, U.S. Corporation, Bank Corporation, it essentially covered the entire industry. I think it was some estimates of 80% of the lenders were covered by these lawsuits and settlements. So what happened beyond the legal settlements? Well, there was huge publicity. And of course, this is what I think also what matters beyond the legal risks. This was 60 Minutes, Dateline, you name it. It was New York Times, Wall Street Journal, front page. Numerous times these hit front page, and it was also big in the African American and Hispanic press. Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push Coalition. In fact, one of my most memorable experiences was being invited and introduced by Jesse Jackson at his Rainbow Push conference, talking about minority financing. But it was a big deal at the time. Interesting thing also is you'd see competition. There were credit union ads, don't finance through the dealer. You've heard about these lawsuits. There were, in fact, small minority-owned banks and credit unions that were advertising directly and saying, you know, you've heard about what the big lenders do to African Americans, we don't. So this kind of publicity actually was quite ubiquitous. And then, of course, this is old stuff, and I realize that, but there was increase at the time of web-based auto financing. So this was starting to take off, and the thought was that this might alleviate some of these problems. So, like I said, these cases are old, but what about now? Well, first of all, as I said, it's actually gotten much harder. A lot of these class action lawsuits are now almost impossible to win because of various Supreme Court rulings. So there really aren't many of these class action lawsuits, at least at the federal level, based on that law. But the federal government, through the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Department of Justice, has continued to bring cases because they can. Again, the law is there. It's just hard to bring these private class action lawsuits. Ally Financial, this was 2013. The most recent one I know of is Toyota Motor. In 2016, and you can see they actually had to pay restitution as well. Fifth Third Bank, Honda, and then they're also going after smaller dealerships. The CFPB issued guidelines to auto lenders to help to try to reduce discrimination. And they considered but never passed a rulemaking that would require a fixed fee, no markups at all. That didn't get a lot of traction. There's, as you can imagine, been a lot of pushback by the industry. And then there are various state cases. There are different legal standards in some states. Some of the cases, in fact, that I've been involved with have gone beyond financing. So in some states, you can look at dealer add-ons such as extended warranties and things like that, and disparate impacts as well. So let me step away from auto lending and say, is this just something that is happening in auto lending? The answer is no. The mortgage lending, this is really common in mortgage lending. Again, you may not realize this, but if you go to a mortgage broker, they oftentimes, again, are shopping around, finding you the best rate, and at the same time finding them the highest markup that they can. They call this a yield spread premium. It's exactly what it sounds like. You mark up the rate. And there have been, again, very similar cases and settlements. I've been involved with some of these: Prime Lending, SunTrust, Bank of America. Bank of America wasn't there. They bought Countrywide, as you probably know. It was a big fiasco, but they had to settle the case as well. And then there's still fair housing discrimination cases, not just lending. So this era is not over. We still see very, very similar things going on. How could the industry have avoided this? And I can't cover all of this right now. Obviously, I'm doing a small version of what I would typically do in a class. But, you know, from a lender's perspective, because think about this. This is a policy. This is the way these lawsuits were written. This is a policy that lenders have that allows their agents to mark up the loans. They don't necessarily have to do that. They could have changed the compensation policy to a fixed commission. And some of them, one of them actually tried that years ago. The problem is that there was this competitive pressure because the dealers saw that they could make more money if they were to mark up the loan. So they would just ignore that lender and go to another lender that allowed for a markup. And of course, the lenders can't collude. That would be against the law as well. They could lobby for support of some kind of regulation that would, like CFPB was thinking about. But this is a hard thing for lenders to do and make money. It doesn't mean it can't be done. And frankly, they haven't tried very hard. That's something that, you know, there may be other business models to try. Part of it, I think, is the direct lending to consumers, which we're seeing a lot more of because of fintech and internet-based lending. But I will say that there's still a question about whether fintech and internet-based lending has a disparate impact. That's still to be determined. From the dealer's perspective or the mortgage broker's perspective, if they wanted to, they could also change their internal compensation and incentives. It's one thing to train. It's another thing to provide incentives. And the way that industry works is that F&I person that I showed you behind the scenes is making a huge commission on that markup. And so the incentives are aligned for a higher markup, not a lower markup. And of course, you could think about restructuring this industry, vertical integration, which reduce this agency problem, but that's hard to do in most industries. Some people thought, well, artificial intelligence might fix this problem if we go to internet-based lending, but I'm not so sure about that. I do want to say that this is really quite fascinating. Researchers have found that computer systems are learning from essentially baking in old attitudes into their learning. And so there's been a series of interesting studies taking place right now that suggests that you can't just let the computer systems determine how individuals make decisions and mock that in what's thought to be a non-discriminatory way. That's a whole nother subject, but I think it's interesting. That's not necessarily the solution, although it could be part of the solution. And then what I want to close on and then open it up for any questions is that there are similar issues that arise anytime a company uses agents. And the example I want to bring to you is the sharing economy. And think about Airbnb. Airbnb, there was a study that found that African-American sounding names are 16% less likely to be accepted by the hosts. There was a class action lawsuit settled against Airbnb in 2018. They've changed their policy. they say essentially that the host cannot obtain the photo of the renter until after they agree to rent. But they still require real names. Under their terms of policy, I have to use my name if I want to book a room. And so that can be a problem. People could still discriminate based on names. But you can see where this is a problem about how Airbnb structures its arrangements with its agents in a way that's non-discriminatory. Uber and Lyft, very similar things. There have been studies showing African-American sounding names have longer waiting times, more cancellations by Uber drivers or Lyft drivers. Interestingly enough, female passengers have been shown to have longer and more expensive trips. Often, I don't want to speculate as to why. People have speculated. It could be one of several reasons. But bottom line is that if you're a company who's hiring agents or contracting with agents, in the court of opinion, whether it's the court of public opinion or the legal court in some cases, you can these days be held responsible and probably should be held responsible for the outcomes, even if you're not directly doing it. And so these become organizational issues. The bottom line, I think, takeaway, hopefully you got from my talk, is that racial disparity is oftentimes very subtle, hard to detect. It can occur even without any kind of racial animus, and it may require changes in business policies, innovative business models, or government regulation if all else fails to solve. So with that, I will take questions and hope you got something out of it. I don't hear anything.
Hey, Professor,
there
I
we
can
go.
read out some of the questions that we're getting in the chat.
Oh, I can see. I can see now. I thought price discrimination would be illegal. Oh, Jennifer, you can charge whatever you want except for in credit markets. You can charge different parties different amounts. So how is this discrimination data found? Yeah, no, they're not handing. Well, actually, let me say something here about this. So, first of all, the only reason I was able to get the auto lending data was because this was in the context of lawsuits. Okay, this was in the context of litigation where the lawyers went to court and sued these companies. And part of the discovery process, the legal discovery process, was them having to turn over these data. Now, what's interesting is that like General Motors Acceptance Corporation, Nissan Motors, the banks, they don't even know the race of the borrower. They're not allowed. They don't want to know the race of the borrower. That's the whole point, right? And so they look objectively at the credit rating and they say, here, this borrower, given this information, it's an 8% loan, or it's a 10% loan, or no, I can't, I won't, it's not within my guidelines. And they don't know anything about the race of the borrower. But that's why what we had to do was take the name and address, date of birth, social security number, I think, yeah, we had that, and then match that up with driver's license data, which the lawyers also had to go to court state by state and obtain. And same with California, they had to state their birth records. They had to justify to the court that this was a legitimate purpose of using these kind of information. So that's how they did it. I will say that in the mortgage area, HUMD, I think it's, I forget, housing, mortgage, I forget what these agencies call, but in the mortgage data, you could actually go online and download mortgage data that has a lot, not as much information, but it has a lot of the credit information. It doesn't have names though, it does not have names, but it does have the race and ethnicity and gender of the borrowers. So you can actually do some of that analysis, and people do that right now. There's a whole small private industry of consultants who help banks and lenders avoid these kinds of problems, but it's not easy. Anything else?
Hey, Mark, I'm just curious how it went from, somebody feels discriminated against. How do they, get to the point where it's a class action lawsuit and, say I feel like I'm having a longer trip because I'm a woman. Like, how did it get from that feeling to being able to prove it and on a mass scale?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I would say that there are two ways these things happen. One is that somebody just, kind of felt this was awfully strange. They kind of pressured it. They signed the loan, then they talked to people. They said, that's an awfully high interest rate or something like that. Or they just have this feeling and they go in, they talk to an attorney, and that's sort of how it starts. On the other hand, some of it is there's a whole industry of class action lawyers, and of course, a lot of businesses completely hate this. But there is a business lawyers, again, a cadre of lawyers who go around and look for these kinds of things, and oftentimes they come to me and they say, I suspect this is going on. What do you think? And we'll start to look into it and think about it. So that's how they happen. The other thing I will say, by the way, is nobody's asked me this, but since you raised about the question about gender, you kind of raised it in your question, and I'm convinced, although I don't have this, I can't prove it, I'm convinced that this could have also been a lawsuit on the basis of gender. The problem was the data are too contaminated because of joint borrowing of male and female borrowers. So too often, there were too few individual women borrowers, and it was too difficult to do that kind of analysis because, again, you've got so many co-borrowers that we could never do that. But the anecdotes, what people would tell you is that they also, women also had higher markups. Ray says, yeah, another study is they've looked at race, the salesperson. Yes, it's true. Yeah, this is interesting. Even Black salespeople discriminate against Black customers. And so we don't, so let me, your question is, could you see if the person doing the markup was Black? The answer is no. We didn't have any information about the F&I person. However, you're quite right. And in fact, what we did have is, again, I knew the dealership, okay? And so one of the things we did at one point was we looked at the dealerships. Again, this was a lawsuit, by the way. The lawsuits were not against the dealers, although there have been some against dealers. But the lawsuit was against the large lenders. Why? Because you could get hundreds of thousands and millions of litigants in one fell swoop. It's a lot cheaper. And they also have the bigger pockets. But it was also the source, the policy that they could stop from the policy perspective, at least that was the lawyers thought. So the lawsuits were not really against the dealers, even though it was the dealers, ironically, that were marking this up. But one of the things that we did find is that African-American owned dealerships and dealerships in particular were some of the most egregious in terms of markups. Now, most of their borrowers were a lot of them, for example, if they'd be in a community that was highly minority, most of the borrowers would be minorities. But if you would compare that to markups elsewhere outside in the white areas, you'd find that in fact they were also marking it up more. I don't know, and this is what we'll never know, is the extent to which any of this is deliberate, in the sense of saying, a Black walks in, I'm going to charge him a higher rate. Like I said, if you think about it, there's lots of reasons why this may happen. Some of it may well be bad, but some of it is much more subtle. Going back to Professor Triana's wonderful talk last week, there's implicit bias that you may not be doing this explicitly or thinking about it. But also, as I said, it could just simply be, we're looking, you as the dealer are looking for the highest markup, and you're classifying people based on a group affiliation, not because you want to charge this particular group more, but because you want to make more money.
Hey, Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
This is Dave Goodrich. Are there any organizations that are actively changing their training processes or for sales folks that are in the position where there's the alignment of achievement of a higher margin or what have you may lead them down a wrong path? Basically, is there diversity in training that makes sure that that these biases don't take place? And are there any examples of companies that are leading the way in terms of that type of training?
Well, Dave, I think you're getting a little out of my expertise, except to say, yes, there's a lot of diversity training going on, no question about it. There's also, as I said, there's sort of there are consulting firms, there are businesses that are set up to do this kind of training, also to test your models. So they'll go in and literally test your credit scoring model and the pricing model to see if it has a discriminatory impact. So yeah, there are people who do this. Is there a company in terms of lenders that's better than others? That I don't know. I tend to see the bad actors, and again, because a lot of, as Aaron's question was before, a lot of this is private. Unless there's a perceived problem, and you have lawyers willing to go in and invest their own money, because it's very expensive to do these kinds of lawsuits, or the Department of Justice wants to go in. They only have so much resources. So you tend to see the bad actors, which means that I'm much more likely, although I don't want to name any, but you can see some of the names from the past, but I'm much more likely to go out to know who the bad actors are. But I will say, I think this is pretty much widespread in all these industries. The hope is that by going online, you reduce a lot of this. Anecdotally, what I think is true is that when you're doing online, it's much less likely, but I don't think it's going to necessarily go away. Because one of the questions, and this is one of the unresolved questions, is, if you're in the finance world and you're coming up with a proprietary credit scoring model, you want to figure out what's the risk of a default in order to price your loan. That's what our MBAs do, and our MSF students do. They want to come up with what's appropriate pricing for the loan. And the question is, are all of those factors completely neutral and objective and based on credit risk, or are some of them not really shown? We don't know ex ante whether it's going to have that kind of an impact. And so a lot of these things are sort of unknown. And then, frankly, even if they are objective, again, I'm not an ethicist, I'm not a moral philosopher. Even if they were objective, would it be appropriate? That's another conversation. It's something that is legitimate for businesses to ask. Am I willing to give up some profits? Am I willing to do this, even though the risk of default is a little bit higher in this group, and spread that across other customers? Well, the competitive market forces suggest that's hard to do. But that's something that I think other firms are grappling with, and sometimes are willing to do as well. Well, I think we're used our time quite well. Unless you have any last minute questions.
Hey, Mark, for the loan industry, I mean, it's by nature predatory, right? Like, you're paying somebody else to use your own money. So can we really expect loan companies not to try to take advantage of every asset that they have available to them? I mean, like, the other option is just to buy your car outright and not be taken advantage of by any loan company.
Well, I think there's
like thing with student loans, like taking advantage of people who don't fully understand the financial process. What can we really expect from these companies?
Well, I guess that's one way to look at it, is what would we expect? And I guess then if that's the case, then the question is, well, do we need laws? Is this something that we need to legislate? And I think there are some larger questions. One is, what about reputation of firms? So do customers care? And the answer is, in the past, maybe not, but I think maybe more and more so. Look at what's happening. Look what's happening when a major company decides the Aunt Jemima brand is no longer valuable. no longer appropriate? Is it because of pure profits, or is it because of the pressure, or is it because they want to feel good and right about it? I don't know. But one could argue, forgetting the ethics and morals of it, one could argue that they're doing it for self-interested reasons because their consumers are mad and don't like this anymore. And maybe in the past it was okay. I don't know. I mean, those are empirical questions. But I think the same question could be asked here. I mean, are financial institutions going to be hit? Look, they hate the publicity of these lawsuits, and these settlements. And does it drive away customers? I don't know. That's something that's hard to study. I would love to know the answer to, but I think that's the best answer I can give you. It's a good question. It's a really good question. Anything else? Well, you've been most attentive, and I hope you found it interesting. Obviously, I do. That's why I work in this area and I teach this stuff. And for those of you who are still in school or coming back to Owen, I'd like to see you in one of my classes if you find this of interest. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor. Great talk and really interesting. Thank you very much for those who joined us today. We do, as Professor mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we do have a few other sessions coming up in the coming weeks. For those who are at school, they should be on your calendar. If not, they will be coming soon. And for our incoming first years, information has been posted on Slack, so you should be able to join us. So thank you again, Professor, for your time today.
Thank you.